Hello, I am Xander Ballwit. I'm the editor-in-chief of Asimov Press, and today I'm speaking with Sean Harrison, who's a researcher in epidemiology and the author of Asimov Press's latest piece, The Uncertain Origins of Aspirin. I'll be diving deeper into some of the themes and getting a chance to ask some questions that came up as I was editing and reading along. Before we dig into the piece, I would love to have Sean introduce himself.
Hi, thanks. Thank you for having me. I'm Sean Harrison, Research Fellow at the University of Exeter. I work as an epidemiologist doing public health research. Mainly what I do is evidence synthesis, so that's answering research questions by finding, analysing and synthesising all the evidence we can find. It's very helpful for policy questions where you just want to know all the evidence in order to make the most informed decision.
All right. Well, thank you so much for coming on the pod. I love this topic of, how do we gather evidence and how do we figure out what is lore and strip away kind of mythology from fact when it comes to medicine, especially things that span a really long period of time. Like I'm currently editing a piece on leech therapy, and I've encountered a lot of the things that you dealt with in looking up this supposedly simple question of the origins of aspirin, where you run into various figures that supposedly said things, and then discover that these are mostly just pop science pieces that are all pointing back at one another. So to give us a flavor of the kind of skepticism and approach that we're in for in your piece, you start with one claim that seems like it could be straightforward, which is about how many people take aspirin or some kind of NSAID annually. And you're already saying that this is just an estimate and it's really hard to know. So I was curious on if you can elaborate into like something like that, like how many people are prescribed something. Why is that a challenge to figure out, and especially in the case of aspirin?
Sure. So it's one of the first pieces of information that you find whenever you look up NSAIDs. It's how many people take it. And NSAIDs include aspirin, but also ibuprofen, naproxen, quite a few others, and they're all quite widely used. But the specific claim was 30 million people take NSAIDs every day. And I really wanted to know how people knew that. Because it wasn't millions of people. Millions of people would be nice and vague. 30 million people is really specific. It's to the nearest 10 million, but it's really specific. And finding out how many people take a specific drug is really hard, especially worldwide. NSAIDs are also prescribed, but they're also taken over the counter. So that's two different ways of people getting them, and you need to kind of figure out how many people are taking them. So I thought maybe they just did a massive worldwide survey, which would be a lot of effort to find out this one number. So I started looking through the references of everything that I found. There were lots of the specific claim, and they just weren't referenced, but some were, which meant I could follow them back. And then there were lots of dead ends, but going through quite a few academic journal articles, I managed to trace it back to a 1987 paper. The claim itself, it was buried in the discussion, wasn't referenced, and it wasn't 30 million people take NSAIDs daily, which was what kept getting repeated. It was over 30 million patients receive NSAIDs on a regular basis worldwide. So it got changed a little in repetition, so it was patients to people, which might mean that originally they looked at hospital records or prescription records, which is only one subset of NSAIDs, and regular basis to daily is also a bit of a change. But it's irrelevant. It's 1987. It's almost 40 years ago. Whatever the true number was then, it's not that now. The world population increased by 3 billion people. The mean global age increased by 9 years. The global obesity prevalence increased by 10%, and people are, on average, richer now. There's no chance it's the same number, but people keep repeating it, and every time it's repeated, it looks fresh, because if you only go back one layer of reference, then, it was referenced in 2016, so that seems fairly recent, or the latest one was 2024. It looks recent.
So you suspect that it's far more people. We have more people who are laboring under more diseases, and people have more access than before. Not to mention this difference between for me, I don't, I'm a people, not a patient for most of my days, and I will take aspirin or some kind of NSAID on occasion. So you think all of this is lost in a figure like that?
Entirely. And one of the studies that we reference in the article is something which says maybe you want to consider taking a low-dose aspirin every day to reduce your cardiovascular risk. That came out after the 1987 article. there's so many reasons why the number should be so much higher now, even if it were correct then, which I've got no real reason to suppose because it wasn't referenced at the time.
Yeah, and I imagine this is a useful number to have. Like, how many people take certain drugs is something that would be like helpful to keep track of for a variety of reasons. Is there a way that that could be like, how would we correct this? Like, if it's actually helpful to know how many people are prescribed something, like, should you, like sign a little note on your way out of the pharmacy, or what should one do?
So, the biggest problem with this specific claim is the worldwide bit. It's not so in places with really good medical records. So UK and US are probably reasonable for this. The UK has extremely good prescription records. It's fragmented because the NHS has very fragmented digital infrastructure, but you can get a reasonable estimate of how many people prescribe specific drugs. It's really quite easy. Over the counter, not a clue, because that you just go into a supermarket and you buy some aspirin, and then you take it as and when you need it. Or you go into a supermarket, buy some aspirin, and take it daily because you're trying to prevent cardiovascular problems. And we have no way of knowing that other than doing surveys of people. And if we were to do that worldwide, that would mean doing a representative survey of everyone in the world. And so there are 7,000 different languages. A quarter of the world's population don't have phones, so you'll need to physically go and visit them or send them mail. But 13% of the world's population is illiterate, so that wouldn't work. And lots of people don't engage with research, which sometimes is okay because people who don't engage are similar to people who do engage. But for something like this, maybe not, and then you'd have a section of the population that you're not doing anything with, so it gets really complicated really quickly trying to do anything worldwide.
Okay. Yeah, sorry, I want to dig into something that you just said, which you said that take it might be like different than like you said, some people would be representative of others. And that made me think of like, when you see a billboard advertising, like, we're doing a big study on psoriasis, like presumably people that didn't have psoriasis would not respond and call in, but the people that do would. So is this always the case, or you mean for something that's like generic, kind of like everyone would take a pain medicine once in a while, they might be representative?
Virtually any research, it's selection bias of who is actually being represented by the research. And sometimes, so the question is always, are the people who aren't participating meaningfully different in ways that affect the outcome from people that are participating? And it's really, because they're not participating, it's really hard to know that. But we can know some things about people who don't participate because we have, say, routine data, and then we compare the routine data between the two groups, those who do participate and those who don't. And it's rarely the case that they have similar outcomes. In this case, the outcome would just be how much do you take aspirin daily? And I think there would be reasons to suppose that they would be different in this particular case. But it's almost universally true that the people who participate in research are just different from people who don't in ways that matter. And there's no...
It sounds like our work is cut out for us here. I'd like to move on to aspirin itself. So one of the first things that we encounter is like when you went into digging into the origins of aspirin, you had heard that it came from willow bark, and then somewhere along the way, like we have distilled it, purified it, synthesized it, arrived at modern aspirin. And there are some good reasons, you say, to think that it did come from willow bark. And the two that you dig into specifically are ubiquity, like there's willows everywhere, and also efficacy. I was wondering if you could kind of expand on those two camps and tell us why these are good reasons to suspect that this claim might be true.
Sure. So willow trees are found all over the world. And people have been using them for millennia, so we go into a few examples. But this accessibility means that the opportunity for someone to, say, put it in some tea or eat the bark is quite high. Much higher than for a plant that only grows in one specific place. It doesn't guarantee that people have tried it, but it raises the chances just so much. So I mentioned cinchona bark in the article, which is native to tropical Andean forests in South America. It's one of the few plants that contain quinine, which means that it's useful for treating malaria, and during European colonialism it was massively farmed and used for that purpose. But most cultures in antiquity, they just didn't have access to it, so there's no possibility of them using it. If willow was as specifically localized as cinchona, it would just massively reduce the chances of anyone trying it, and so finding it contain something useful. For aspirin, the most useful thing in willow bark is something called salicin. It's converted to salicylic acid in the body. Aspirin, also converted to salicylic acid in the body. It's likely the compound that makes aspirin work. It blocks something called a COX enzyme, and that enzyme is responsible for producing the things that cause inflammation, fever, and pain. So if salicin can work like aspirin, then at least theoretically, willow bark could be used for the same purposes as aspirin if you can get enough salicin from it. And willow bark actually has other things in it too, which makes this more complicated. But the analogy I have for this is, if it were a murder investigation, we have opportunity and motive. Opportunity because willow grows everywhere, and motive because theoretically it could be used for the same purpose.
Okay, interesting. Well, thanks so much. Yeah, let's see. My next question has to do with kind of still that first section in your piece where you're digging into some of the really ancient evidence and referring to some old scholars of medicine. And you talk about the Aber's Papyrus and Hippocrates and Pliny the Elder. What are some of the difficulties when you have to go back into the medical history this far and deal with them, contend with millennia of stories getting twisted in various ways?
So, surprisingly, at least for me, the biggest challenge wasn't access to the evidence. Most of the ancient sources of evidence, freely available online copies. The copyright presumably expired a while ago, so it's just online for anyone to have a look at. Potentially the biggest problem is that the sources were written in languages that either just aren't used, or have changed substantially from when they were written. So we have to rely on translations. And some translations will differ. So Hippocrates has been translated a few times, and the translations are different in some ways. And sometimes we have no direct translation for what's being talked about. So the Eber's Papyrus, it mentions met, which could mean nerves, or it could mean blood vessels, or it could mean something else. But it's kind of important to know because it's one of the few things in there that I found that uses something called splinter of the willow tree, which probably willow bark, but again, that's kind of a guess because the translation isn't perfect. And relying on secondary sources like a translation, it gives us a source of bias, so a possible systematic deviation from the truth, whatever that is. And that's just how it is. I can't read the ancient Egyptian or the ancient Greek or the Latin, so it's potentially a source of problems when you go further back in time. And I should say the evidence we do have access to will just be a small, tiny subset of the evidence that would have been available at the time. There could have been a document which said, "Oh yeah, we use willow bark. We always use willow bark. Why wouldn't we use it to treat this particular thing?" It might have existed. It's just it doesn't now. So we're only looking at a small subset of what existed at the time.
And so there's opportunities for us to lose information and have the people that are then now telling us the information. Like, we're very reliant on the translations being accurate, and there's all sorts of ambiguity in things that are languages that are lost and terms that are no longer used. I am curious, when you talk about one author in particular who wrote a history about this. You say John Mann in his book Murder, Magic, and Medicine claims that the Aber's Papyrus contained a remedy referring specifically to willow bark. And you went into this, well, you said, first of all, Mann doesn't reference a translation that he's using. This seems pretty bad, and I was kind of curious what happens when people that are telling medical histories will say something like this, even though there's really no basis for it. I imagine it might be well-meaning, but I'd like to hear kind of what you think is going on.
So I did go back to this because, not giving any references would be bad. I didn't see any references, but I found a more complete edition of Murder, Magic, and Medicine, which is the book by John Mann. And at the back, it does have a list of references, including one for the translation of the Eber's Papyrus by Cyril Bryan. That's the translation I used. It's online, and we reference it in the article. It's the translation I used to look for references to willow bark. And in the Murder, Magic, and Medicine, Mann does give a description. He says the description is a particularly apposite description of both the inflammatory condition and the efficacy of willow extracts, and I cannot find it anywhere in that translation. But the Eber's Papyrus, it was actually translated by Ebers into German. It called Ebers because he translated it, and then into English by Cyril Bryan in, I think, 1930. There could be different editions of the translation. and any one of them could be the correct translation of the translation of the original ancient Egyptian. There's no way to know. But the references, the quote from Murder, Magic, Medicine, the description that John Mann gives, could have been in a different edition entirely of a translation of the Ebers Papyrus, because the references are only given right at the end of the book, not in direct reference to the thing that he was claiming. So there's no guarantee that the reference given at the back corresponds to the quote in the book. It's very irritating when this happens, because it's very hard to then piece together which evidence are you using to support this particular claim. I'm guessing people do it with books because it avoids cluttering it up with references, makes it more readable, but it makes it just hard to go back through the evidence. So I don't know why I couldn't reconcile what Mann said about the Ebers Papyrus with the translation that I saw. I'm unwilling to take his word for it, because I had a copy to hand, I went through it, I couldn't find anything. I found a couple of instances of willow bark, it's just they weren't what was in John Mann's book.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, so I like, first of all, like I like it could be buried. Maybe there's a passing mention, or the references are down somewhere else. So it seems like there's all sorts of reasons to struggle to find specific. It made me think of the term Hapax legomena with something that only appears once. So like maybe it's in there somewhere, but it's like a passing mention. All right, so moving on a little bit, I want to go back to this notion of efficacy because I thought this was really interesting. I once went to a poison garden somewhere in northern England, and like everything in the garden was supposedly poisonous, and then inevitably the tour guide would get to each and be like, well, in order to actually die from rhubarb, you would have to consume, this whole plot, or like this berry would kill you if you had several thousand. And this kind of felt like something that was appearing in your piece as well, where yes, salicin is in willow, but the amount that you would need would be preposterous. So I wondered if you could speak a little bit to this issue of efficacy.
When there's been a few studies that looked at comparing how much salicylic acid you get in your blood when you consume a certain quantity of salicin. And there have been other studies that have looked at how much salicin is in willow bark. And both answers are kind of a bit variable. Different willow trees, their bark contains different levels of salicin, from a basically negligible amount to a reasonable amount. And of course, when you make tea, not all the salicin will get into the water. A proportion will get into the water, but kind of unknown amount, depends how long you steep it for, and depends on the bark itself. But I took kind of reasonably generous numbers and put them together to find how much willow bark tea you would need to consume in order to get a daily dose of aspirin. And it is a preposterous amount. I think it was 41 cups of tea, like 10 gallons. It's an unholy amount of tea to drink.
Not to mention it doesn't taste very good. Apparently, it's bitter as all hell.
It's really bitter. So you'd need to get through the bitterness and drink an amount of tea that, honestly, you shouldn't drink that much water in one sitting anyway. Water by itself will cause problems. So yeah, you certainly can't get a daily dose of aspirin out of willow bark tea just by stripping some willow bark off, putting it in tea, and then drinking it. There might be ways to do it by concentrating the effect. So we talk about Reverend Edward Stone in the article. His method was to dry it all out, pulverize it, and then use that. So that concentrates the effect, and you might get more from that. But yeah, it's really unlikely that you'll be able to go out and shave some willow bark, and then it's going to be aspirin. It's just,
interesting. Before we move on to Reverend Stone, I am curious about the value of testing things like this. Like, is there a big contingent of medical researchers that are interested in combing through literature like this and being like, well, okay, now we have to bring a bunch of people into the study. We're going to make them tea in various concentrations and see if it would have been feasible. It sounded like maybe there was some version of this that actually was done, but you're like, ultimately, we need to know more. Is this kind of thing valuable? I mean, it might vary for various claims, but like gathering people to try to test old claims like this about efficacy or indications, is this something that you've thought about?
So, in general, validation of previous studies, not necessarily about basically tree tea, but validation of previous claims, very, very important. So we have, in medicine and psychology, replication crises of things failing to replicate. Things we thought were true, which are not true. And the point of the validation studies is that it helps us look again at things that we think we know but we don't know. And it goes both ways, as things that are not true, which we need to know. So it's incredibly valuable to find things that we thought were true that weren't. But it works the other way too. Things that we thought didn't work that do, in fact, work. There's an example which I wanted to put in the article, but it was already very big. So paracetamol. It was actually discovered before aspirin. So a few years before aspirin, they discovered paracetamol. And a German pharmacologist called von Mehring, he published something that said paracetamol has a slight tendency to produce a particular side effect. It's really hard to pronounce. Methemoglobinemia. That might be right. Because of this, paracetamol it was just discarded entirely in favour of something called phenacetin, which has since been withdrawn. That lasted until about the 70s, and it was withdrawn from I think Canada and the US and the UK around the same time. And it wasn't until 1947, so over 50 years later, when some researchers looked at the metabolite of a different drug, saw it as paracetamol, and then went, oh, maybe it's useful, maybe we should look at paracetamol again. So an accidental finding 50 years after the fact prompted basically validation studies and the decision that actually paracetamol is really useful and we can use it and it's great. So yeah, validation studies, they work great for finding both those things.
And there's no limit at which you're like, well, this is a validation study for claims that were made thousands of years ago. Like, are those kind of equally as interesting, or does it feel like maybe this is an arbitrary cutoff? Like, there's like things 50 years old might be useful, but things 100 not so much. Like, I don't know if maybe some of these ancient ones are what makes me go like, I don't know. Like, should we check out all of the various tinctures and stews?
There certainly can be good things that happen from it. So the reason we have quinine is because of cinchona bark, and that was just a natural remedy in South America, in the Andes at the time. There will be other things, or there will have been other things, where something has been used, and it's been used because it worked, not just because it was the done thing at the time. Finding out, was it done because it worked, or was it done because that was just the tradition of doing it? Finding that out is very hard.
Right, and it's so often the case, like we might not know the mechanism of action until far later, if we ever do, as you get to in your piece. But people are, I think maybe I still am kind of struggling against this tendency to be like, the ancients just didn't know as much as we know today, and that isn't giving them a lot of credit.
In fairness, they did seem to put lots of things into one remedy. In the Eva's Bataras, we talk about the treatment for making the Met supple, and that includes 34 things all at once. And it's kind of just, we're going to wang all this stuff together and hope for the best.
Well, as someone who likes really complex food, I'm very sympathetic to people that are like, maybe just more ingredients are better. Yes, I would love to move ahead a little bit. So you started to talk about stone, and that's where we're kind of moving through the ancient world into the 18th century, if I'm correct. And you say this is where you think maybe it actually begins. So the ancients might have been maybe onto something or using something that would later be relevant, but we start to see like a systematic investigation in the 18th century. Can you elaborate a little bit on Stone and what his methods were?
Sure. So Reverend Edward Stone, he was a cleric, Church of England cleric. I looked at that. He was also a justice of the peace, which sounds very cool. But he lived in a small town, Chipping Norton, and for some reason, and it's not clear why, he had cause to treat people suffering from agues, which is malarial fever. And malaria was endemic to England at the time. It was endemic to lots of places, I think, at the time. But he wrote what is very possibly the first scientific account of using willow bark to treat fever in kind of an experimental way. He gives a quite detailed report, and it's online, you can read it, and it's virtually in modern English, it's great. But he said he accidentally tasted willow bark, and he found it was extraordinarily bitter, like cinchona bark, which was used at the time to treat malaria. So he figured that because it was bitter, and because it grew in moist and wet soil where agues chiefly abound, it might be as helpful as the cinchona bark was. So he grabbed some, dried out for 3 months by a baker's oven, and started giving it to people with agues. He started really, really small, so he started with a few grains, which would have been almost nothing. And he just put it in beer, milk, water, whatever they were drinking, and it didn't cause any problems, so he ramped up the dose. Fine. He ended up treating 50 people over 5 years, and his conclusion was they were all either cured or helped by the treatment. So, great. If this were evidence presented now, I'd probably be a bit sceptical of what he was talking about. And it doesn't look like Stone's research led to anything at that immediate time. It doesn't look like willow bark became a curative or used widely, certainly in the next 50 years in England. Nonetheless, so Stone was referenced by a group of people later on who started looking into the chemistry of willow bark, and the evidence is much clearer that what they were doing led directly to aspirin. So he was referenced by people who definitely went to aspirin, which means I think it's my best guess would be that this all started with Stone. And it didn't start with Stone.
Yeah.
Yeah. It didn't start with Stone because it was the done thing at the time. He looked at the herbalists. That doesn't sound right. He looked at the botanist books at the time. He found nothing for willow bark. Other people have done the same, like contemporary people have done the same and found nothing at the time. He thought it would work because it was bitter and it grew in the right place. It wasn't because of anything else that came before. It kind of just started, at least for Stone, it started there.
That was a delightful addition in your piece as well, where you said, like at the time, like, he was one of these people who believed that often the cure could be found close to the source of the disease. I'm curious how long this idea persisted. When I read that, I was like, that feels like very charming, like as if the world was like offering up, like, yes, here's a blight, but then also like we're going to give you a little bit of a solid. Was this something that persisted for a long time, and is there any remnants of it still today, where people are kind of looking in the same place for cure and disease?
So, yeah, it kind of hasn't gone away in that respect. There are people today. Homeopathy. I looked it up online. Certainly some homeopathists believe the same sort of deal, that if a plant either grows in the same place or looks like the organ which is in trouble. So you get things like liverwort, which looks like the liver, so it's used to treat liver things. Lungwort resembles diseased lungs, so it's used to treat lung things. And eye bright flowers, they resemble eyes, so used to treat that. So yeah, at least some people who practice homeopathy are still using, this is the doctrine of signatures, where it is helpful, usually divine hints that you can find the remedy to this particular illness because it looks like this, or because it has the same colour, or because it grows in the right place. So it's the doctrine of signatures. So yeah, a cursory look online, it seems like it's still being used today for the same purpose. And
yeah, some of these sounded, obviously, like I'll read them and be like, well, that sounds, bogus. Like, just because it looks like something doesn't mean it's good. But then at the same time, it made me think of, we published a piece on phages and how people often find, really valuable bacteriophages to treat, diseases that they've gotten from bacteria in these like bacteria-ridden sewers and cesspits. And I was like, wait, actually, doctrine and signatures, maybe they're onto something.
So I think that part of it, the location, that is reasonably fine. Because a lot of our antibiotics. There was the recent piece in Asimov Press about finding new antibiotics, and it's bacteria that are producing antibiotics as a defense against other things that are nearby. They have to be nearby; they wouldn't produce them otherwise. So yeah, if you're getting a specific disease in a specific place, it's possible that there is something there that has already evolved a defense against it. And it's not just the things that are going there. The penicillin is a mold that produced penicillin to prevent attacks by disease. So it makes sense that it would be in the same sort of place if there's something already in existence that can deal with it.
So coevolution, real, shapes, probably not so much.
Yeah, the shapes. I think I read there is literally no evidence that the shape of a plant has anything to do with the treatment. But place, Possibly.
All right. So moving forward past all the efficacy in the ancients and even the 18th century, and kind of getting into modern times and the synthesis of aspirin, we run into a different problem, and it's not so much related to translations or the absence of evidence, and it's more related to something that we continue to see in modern science, which is this idea of prejudice. I would love to hear you sum up kind of what the original aspirin controversy was, and tell us a little bit about what happened here.
Okay, so it all comes down to a 1949 article. It's written by um, a German Jew, Arthur Eichengren, where he claims he was essentially removed from the discovery of aspirin. There are two competing claims about the discovery. And the first one is the official story that comes from Bayer, the pharmaceutical company that made aspirin and continues to make aspirin. It claims someone called Hoffman created aspirin to help his father, who was suffering from severe rheumatism. Hoffman had treated his father with salicylic acid, fine, but his father had severe side effects, nausea, gastric irritation, tinnitus. It's basically the side effects of aspirin ramped up because it's more effective, basically. So Hoffman set out to produce a purer derivative of salicylic acid that would be as effective but not cause all the side effects. This version of events, it was first reported in a footnote of a 1934 book, The History of Chemical Engineering, and as a story, it's really good. It hangs together very well, and it's very sympathetic, and it's a good story. The story from Arthur Eichengren is that he worked at Bayer. He was appointed in 1895 to establish and manage a pharmaceutical laboratory at Bayer. He claims he instructed Hoffman to synthesize acetyl salicylic acid, so that was later named aspirin, so I'll just call it aspirin, in 1898, and that Hoffman did so without knowing why. He was just told to do this, so he did it. And then Eichengren also claimed several different Bayer chemists made different derivatives of salicylic acid. They were just looking for something that worked as well, but without the side effects. So they tested lots of different derivatives. Lots of people tested lots of different derivatives. After Hoffman synthesized aspirin, and there's no controversy that it was aspirin who synthesized it. It's in his notebook, and his name's on the US patent. He may not have been the very, very first person to do so, but this is the start of aspirin. Other people did so accidentally, and it wasn't pure and things like that. So once he did it, it went for animal tests, same as the other derivatives. Someone called Heinrich Dreser led Bayer's pharmaceutical lab, and he led all the testing of these different derivatives. He didn't like aspirin. He said it was a direct cardiac poison and opposed it progressing to clinical trials. And I think that point is reasonably sound. It's not just Eichengren saying that. But Eichengren did like aspirin. He thought it would be the future of pain relief. And he organised private clinical trials. He gave doctors homemade aspirin and asked them to record the results and send it back. It turns out it worked, which is really good because...
He was also doing some self-testing, is that right?
He did some self-testing as well. Yeah, a lot of what I've read is people did a lot of self-testing, and then they got their friends to try it as well. But yeah, he was organising secret clinical trials with homemade drugs, which, I mean, it doesn't often work out well, that kind of thing, but it did in this case. He then managed to convince Bayer that they should conduct more tests, do more clinical tests. And Dreser continued to dislike it. He said, basically, no, it's worthless. But eventually they did the tests, and it worked well enough that Bayer started selling it. Great. So we have these two competing kind of stories about what actually happened. But the timing is important. Bayer's official story, or not the official story, Bayer questioned why Eichengren waited so long to set the record straight. I mean, this all happened in the 1890s. It was the 1934 book that came out that had this story in it. It's possible that hadn't been released before, and that was just the start of where that story started, so Eichengren had no reason to do anything before that point. But in 1934, I mentioned Eichengren was Jewish, and that is relevant because it was 1934 in Germany at the time that Nazis were very much in power. So even if you were aware of the story, and there's no guarantee he was, it's a textbook, it's a chemistry textbook, there's no reason why he necessarily would have seen it. but he wouldn't have been in a position to refute it. At that time, there was just no real chance of him going, oh, actually, it was me. At the time, Nazis were very much engaged in censorship, anti-Jewish legislation and sentiment and propaganda, which included textbooks, and they likely could have removed Eichengrund from the history of aspirin just entirely. And if there was evidence at Bayer before 1934 that Eichengrund was instrumental in the development of aspirin, and his position what he was that he was, then it could have been destroyed, either because Nazis and they were working to get rid of this, or it was 35 years ago by that point, and they would have been physical documents. They wouldn't necessarily have kept all the physical documents.
Interesting. So when Eichengrund came out with his own counterclaim, which was in 1949, so after this all happened, and they're like, we don't understand, why would you have waited so long? Like, that seems fairly, like, that's a, obviously there's reasons why he would have waited so long. But the other thing that they mentioned was that he was at the same level as Hoffman in terms of their seniority, so it did seem strange to them. Like, that felt a little bit more relevant, perhaps. Like, who would Eichengrund have been to be like, hey, colleague, and do this thing for me? I mean, I guess he's already aware of the prejudice, perhaps, but I feel like that was the only thing in the claims that kind of seemed to land. But yeah,
that is a difficult one, because Eichengrund's claim was he was the head of he was brought in to lead that particular division, so naturally Hoffman would not have been leading it as well. But it was a reappraisal that led us all to this. It was Walter Sneeder wrote a 1999 article called "The Discovery of Aspirin: A Reappraisal," and he looked at as much evidence as he could find, and that included the 1949 article, but included also some additional evidence. And his conclusion was that it's likely that aspirin was synthesized under Eichengrund's direction, and it wouldn't have been introduced in 1899 without his intervention. And that, like, everything considered, that feels like the most parsimonious explanation for what happened. It is relevant that in 1899, people didn't really talk about the inventors of whatever the drug was. The company invented the drug, and that was kind of that. So even at the time, Eichengrund wouldn't have had any reason to kind of go, actually, it was me doing it, because that wasn't the done thing at the time. He went to a museum in, I think, Munich, which had a display for the inventors of aspirin, and it had Hoffman and Dreser, but not Eichengrund. And yes, he wasn't happy about that.
Yeah, that would certainly be enough for me to want to publish a letter. And so ultimately, this controversy is still unresolved. I saw some Wikipedia pages that looked hot for editing, but they were like, still open questions.
Yeah, we'll never know, I think, because if the evidence existed, it now doesn't. And it's too far back in time. We'll never know.
Interesting. Yeah, that's such a fascinating chapter in this whole piece. I am kind of curious as well. Like, this is something that we continue to see. Like, in a lot of these, things about like ancient evidence, and some of this is kind of more like locked up, and like we have what we have at this point. But in terms of people's accomplishments continuing to be undermined by prejudice and by changes in kind of the political arena, this is something that we continue to see today. Do you have a sense of how large a problem this particular thing is?
It's really hard. So erasure of information, where things are literally like taken offline or physically destroyed, that's so hard to deal with. People are so the US government was removing data sets and removing web pages and things like that. The data sets being deleted, people did go and archive them before they were deleted. But for web pages with things like the Wayback Machine from the Internet Archive, which is wonderful. The Internet Archive is where I got a lot of the evidence for this, because they host loads of information, and that saves web pages over time. So the content is preserved, but accessibility to those things is now very hard. The original data sets are stored somewhere, but they're not stored where they were easily accessible. The web pages are accessible in that you can go to the Wayback Machine and find the web page at possibly the right time point that you're looking for, and find maybe the content that was there. But there's barriers now to accessing them. And once you remove data or content out of kind of official systems, you then get doubts about its authenticity. there's no real reason why people who were archiving data sets couldn't manipulate them in some way to help them in some way. You'd never know. With official systems, you have kind of accountability about the accuracy or veracity of the content and the data. That kind of disappears a little when it's individuals archiving something for posterity. So things like the Internet Archive and people archiving things is incredibly valuable, but it's not a panacea for the erasure of information. I don't know what would be. There's a quote from
You foresaw
1984.
my next question is going to be how do we safeguard against this and make our findings more robust?
There's a quote from 1984 which feels extreme, but it seems opposite. Who controls the past controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past. Most people now don't have access to the things that were erased, and they won't know that there are other things. They won't know they exist, but now not on the official channels. So my best bet for who would safeguard knowledge is independent organisations. So the people who are doing this, great, and shout out to Wikipedia. Like, it remains a good source of information. It's a neutral and reasonably safe source of information. It's great. But my other thought is referencing. I talk a lot about referencing, but providing references, it means that the original evidence, whatever that was, the websites, the data, if they disappear, there's still a record that it existed because it's in a reference. So you get some sense of what the information contained, and you know that it exists. Well, ideally, if you assume the reference is accurate, you know it existed. So governments can remove information from sites, but they can't remove references that it existed. In 1984, they had whole departments removing those references for that exact reason. If there's no reference to it, then there's nothing. Like, it's completely erased. While there are references to it, it existed, and now people might be aware of that.
Interesting, a little Easter egg. So I wanted to kind of jump down to the conclusion a little bit and talk about, how we can be better scientific communicators and use better references and things of that nature, and also how we can be better readers and kind of make demands on that. But before we do that, I didn't want to lose sight of the great lengths you went to try to do evidence gathering for this piece. And there was one especially interesting saga, and I was curious if that didn't make it, or maybe it made it into the piece as a footnote, but if you can expand on that.
So I think it made it in as a footnote, but it was to get this. I mean, it's a massive book, but it's the whole volume of articles from the 1949 issue of the journal that Arthur Eichengrun published in. So it's a massive book written in German. There we go, or 1949 German, and the reason I had to go to such lengths to get it, the article didn't exist online. It's fairly common for things kind of in the early, mid to late 20th century to not exist online. Journals were pretty good at digitizing their archives from the year 2000 onwards, but not great before then. The Internet Archive is also wonderful for finding lots of things from quite long ago that are now out of copyright. I don't think this is out of copyright. Hard to know. It's from 1949. So that wasn't on there. I first tried to find it, just find a physical copy. Well, I tried to find a digital copy, couldn't, then tried to find a physical copy. There was one for sale, this one, on Poland's version of eBay. So, not speaking Polish, I Google translated to ask the seller, can you please send this to the UK? Because they had a statement saying we don't send to the UK. Fine, that's okay. So I had a nice conversation with them through Google Translate, and they said they'd send it over. Great, ordered it. DHL lost it, and they lost it for about 2 months. And in that time, I despaired quite a lot because this was the only copy I could find online at all. But I contacted the British Library, who have they're a copyright library, so they have the ability to have anything that gets published physically located in their archives. And someone very helpful there went and scanned a copy for me and sent it over so I could actually write something about this. And then like a month later, the physical copy turned up.
Oh my God. Well,
So
thank God for archivists. But yeah, that was quite the journey. And meanwhile, that was the section where I was like, this is great, but it would be so much better with like specific evidence from the thing. And you're like, don't you know I'm trying?
it was very helpful. It had so I'd seen references to it. Sneeder's article contained lots of references to it, but again, that's now secondary evidence. Sneeder interpreted it and put what he thought was important into his piece. So I had that, but not the original. And there were things in the original that were useful to know independently. Also, yeah, it is written in German, so I Google translated it and did a bit of editing on it, and now both the German and the translated version are up on the Internet Archive. So if anybody does want to read
anyone
them,
wants to do a follow-up, it's there. You've done it.
yeah.
Amazing. All right, I want to go forward to kind of, yeah, what do we do from here? And I wanted to just read something about references from your conclusion, because I thought you put it so well. And you just say, your references matter. They are the evidence that we even have giants supporting us. All scientific claims should be referenced. It isn't sufficient for you to state that Hippocrates prescribed willow bark tea to treat inflammatory pain. You need to show us why you think that is true. And I guess to you, I would put, what does this actually look like in practice? I imagine that a lot of scientists are, saying that they're, trying to do the best they can, and they maybe use some conjecture to make their work more interesting, or, but they really do their best. And maybe this is a very charitable take, but I'm curious how we can do better and what that looks like for scientific communicators and also researchers.
So I think the fundamental thing is that consistently making sure whatever claim is being made is referenced by the correct evidence. It would go so far. If it's conjecture, fine, but it needs to be clear that it's a conjecture, not a necessarily this claim is being made because of this evidence. This claim is being made because I think this, and this, and those things together produce this result. That's fine. But it would be immensely helpful to know what evidence is supporting the claim. The main thing is that others are then able to verify the evidence that's being used to make the claim. So not everyone's going to understand all the evidence, and that's absolutely fine. Some people will be experts in the field, and they can look at the evidence and go, yeah, okay, that does support it. So individually, we might not be able to work out, is this claim justified? But collectively, often we should be able to work it out if it's referenced. And a lot of the problems I experienced doing this was that claims just weren't referenced. I also had instances where the references didn't support the evidence, so I said making sure the claim is referenced by the correct evidence, because I met plenty of references that were to completely irrelevant things, and it's just like references are, to be fair, quite hard. You can have tens, hundreds supporting a specific thing, and you need to keep track of all of them. It's quite hard, yeah. But it makes it really hard to then go back and verify, is that claim justified?
Yeah, I'm very sensitive to people are writers looking for keywords in a paper, and they need to support what something is, but then they'll grasp at the first couple articles that come up because it shares a few of the sentences in common, and they kind of wish their main idea was in there, and then you actually read the full piece in the background and you're like, this isn't even about the thing, or it actually supports the opposite conclusion. Just because it shares the same kind of object of study doesn't mean that it's necessarily a supporting claim.
It happened a lot in the 30 million people taking NSAIDs daily claim. And yeah, I don't really doubt that most people who are writing science want to kind of get ideas out there, and that they fully believe that the claims are being made, and generally that the evidence that's being used to support the claims that is right. It's easy to take shortcuts and only look at the title or only look at the abstract and go, okay, that's probably going to support it. I mean, I've written academic papers for a long time, and early on, I probably did that too. It takes so long to support particular claims. It's not the best way to go about doing it, and it's not transparent. Believing things to be true because of the evidence is one thing. Believing things to be true and then hoping that the evidence supports that is a level down from that. I used a metaphor about standing on the shoulders of giants. It's something Newton said, but it went back long before him. The metaphor I belaboured was that using appropriate evidence, it gives visibility and transparency to the claims, and it gives visibility and transparency to the giants happen to be supporting you when you make the claims. If that's hidden because the references aren't there, or they're not correct, then you might as well be stood on a rusty bicycle, and then you're trying to convince people you're stood on the Statue of Liberty or Colossus of Rhodes or something, or just a really tall building, and shouting out that this is true, but actually you're not, because
You're standing on something seismically unsound.
yeah.
Very good. Amazing. I guess, yeah, thank you so much for talking with me. This is definitely it's safe to say, our most thoroughly researched piece ever about research itself, involved.
Thank you.
Maybe to end, how many hours do you think you put into the creation of this piece?
I actually have no sensible idea of how long it took. Like the bulk of it was going through evidence. Writing of it takes time, but it's sourcing all of the evidence. And I think I got a lot better at using Google Translate, because most of the evidence is either in German or Italian, and I don't speak either very well.
Well, those are the languages of chemists, so you have to,
Yep.
if you're going to be in epidemiology and researching drugs, maybe it's time for German lessons. So thank you so much for talking with me, and everyone should
Thank
go ahead
you.
and read The Uncertain Origins of NSAIDs. Thanks so much, Sean.
Brilliant. Thank you very much.